Good to see you back again, and we have changed the agenda around slightly. I will speak to you now because I know you need a good rest and a good little sleep, so happily fall asleep while I speak. I'm an academic, I'm used to that. I'm used to my students falling asleep while I speak, so just enjoy your little kip and you'll be ready for Dr. Con when he's up here. But no, thank you again. I've called this one the fossil dilemma, which is sort of like the other dilemma in the last talk. In the last talk, we sort of have all this information, but we don't quite know how to use it with landscapes, and the same with fossils. And that's why I wrote in your notes. Now, does everybody have notes? Everybody got their notes? Excellent. And you will need pens again because I'm going to give you some figures later. And my wife is shaking her head because she knows I'm being very academic right now and instructing you how to learn. But I opened up the notes there with a particular fable called The Inquisitive Man. Now, you may not have read The Inquisitive Man or heard about it, but it's about a person who goes into a museum and has a good look around and sees many features in the museum, many animals on display, and when he comes out, somebody says, "What did you think of it?" "Oh yeah, it was great, great. But what did you think of the elephant in the museum?" And he went, "What elephant? What elephant? I didn't see it." And that's the message I'm trying to get across that I did this morning with the landscapes. It is such a clear picture that when we look at it, we should see it. But unfortunately, most academics, most professors and so on, don't see what is called the elephant, the missing piece. They see something else. They see all the little things. They see water gaps. They see plateaus. They see all of these things, but they don't connect them together to create a big image. Just as this person who went in a museum did not see the elephant. And the same goes on here. I'm going to talk about fossils now, and there's some very interesting information about fossils and how they're formed, but for some reason we don't seem to see the bigger picture of what does that mean. If we find out how fossils are formed and are able to produce fossils, what impact should that have upon our understanding of evolution? Because I'm going to highlight that the understanding we have is completely wrong. And that's modern scientific data again, pointing to a different conclusion. But for some reason we don't see the big picture. We don't see the elephant in the room. We miss it. And so we keep looking at all the little things but not the big things. So I hope in this talk, whilst I talk about fossils and how they are created, I hope in the end I make it very clear what the big picture is, not what the little bit about the fossils is, and so on. And so I'll be talking about fossils because the fascinating thing is we know what is needed to create a fossil, but guess what? Today, we can't find it. We cannot create fossils today. Now, this is interesting because Dr. Con spoke of a way of thinking called uniformitarianism, where we think that what happens today happens yesterday, happened 10 years ago, happened 1,000 years ago. We look at our landscapes or our fossils or our stars and we think that what we see today, those processes or changes are what happened then and what happened then and what happened then. Now reverse that. If they ask you, fossils were created here and here and here and here, and they show us evolution as they go from micro to little creatures, to dinosaurs, to animals, to birds. And it's a history of evolution. Well, here's the question. How come we're not creating fossils today for the future? How come fossils are not being formed today? If fossils were created all through history, what happened today? Why has it stopped? Because we are not, because paleontologists, those people who go looking for fossils around the world, guess how many fossils they found being created today? The answer is 0. There is not a fossil being created on this planet today. We have a history of fossils, but none today. Something is wrong. There's an elephant in the room. We're missing something. We're not understanding something. So, I thought I'd have a bit of fun first of all. We talk about fossil formation. And I've chosen fish. Why? Because fish are marine creatures are 99% of all fossils are marine. You might think they're dinosaurs. No, they're not. There are very few dinosaur species, very few mammal species, very few bird species, trillions of marine species. And so I thought I'd give you this little cartoon of a happy fish swimming in water. And I would like you to pay particular attention to the fish's emotions. The emotions are going to change during this period. So there, I can see you grinning, you know. So there's a happy fish because the water is pure and clean and got good food in it and all the rest. But something is going to make that fish very, very worried. And that is called sediment. That is the dirt that washes off the land that we talked about this morning. Washes off the land and becomes sediment and lays it down. Now that fish is becoming panicky and worried because now the water quality, the food supply, the viscosity, all sorts of big words of light penetration, all the rest changed. So you can see it's a very worried looking fish because it knows what's going to happen next. And that is, it's buried. Buried under sediment. And now it's an unhappy fish. Buried under sediment. And over time, it will lose all the rest of it and become a fossil. Now you'll notice the fish is happy again. The fish is happy again because it knows that a scientist is going to come along and give it a new name. And that scientist is going to try and interpret what it is. So if I found that fossil, I mean, if you found the fossil, you name the fossil after yourself. You can do that. So if I found the fossil, it now becomes Rondosa nelliplasia. I think that sounds good as a name, you know what I mean? So you could name it after yourself. I won't ask you, Don, to do that, but you know what I mean? And Con, you'd actually give an interesting name for that. Now what's my point here? My point here is that whether you go to a geologic website, a geologic textbook, a Christian website, a Christian textbook, we are all going to say the same thing. And that is that to create a fossil, you need rapid burial, very deep burial as well. Fast and furious, like the movie. It's going to be lots of sediment coming very fast. That's what you need. Absolutely, you need that. And the point I made when I started this, what I want to talk about now, is that we know we need rapid and deep sedimentation, but here's the problem. This will shock you. Nowhere in the world do we actually observe, measure, or see rapid and deep sedimentation. In other words, the world today is not operating like it did in the past, supposedly. Something has changed. Or maybe something hasn't changed. Maybe something happened in the past that we think should be happening today. So, I'm going to look at sediment. Now, when we look at sediment and interpretation, if I showed you that picture there, it's a construction site. Does that look like a lot of sediment to you? Now, I know you're being quiet, but if you don't want to say anything, you can do this. It means a lot of sediment. Or, no, that's not a lot of sediment. Let's have a reaction. What do you want to do? Is it a lot of sediment? It looks like a lot of sediment. And I could take a measurement, and it will be concentration, a lot of sediment in a limited amount of water. But will that go out and change the landscape? Will all of that sediment go out and bury a fish many metres deep? The answer is no. Why? Because that sediment goes out over a vast area and becomes very thinly spread. The sand here, the silt there, the clay there. And so we have to be very careful. We think that today we have an environmental problem called sediment. We actually don't, compared to the past. Today's one of the better times ever. In Australia, the media and the government claim that the Great Barrier Reef is being damaged by sediment. That's been proven in the courts to be wrong, and the barrier reef today is the most beautiful, most healthy barrier reef in history of all of our monitoring. So this argument that sediment is too much is false on the barrier reef. Just like there. Now what happens is we look at it and we think it's a lot, but we have to measure it. Now here's an example, Takatuma Lagoon in the Cook Islands. Now I gave you a little bit of my journey as I travelled the world and was really looking to find out who am I. And I lived in all these countries. When I came back to Australia, the Cook Island government now recognised me as an expert in sediment and floods and all of these sort of things. So they contacted me and said, would you come to Rarotonga and look at the Takatuma Lagoon? We are afraid that that sediment is causing damage to the corals. Because they looked at it, and what do you think they saw? Lots of sediment. It looks like lots of sediment, doesn't it? And basically, would you come over for 2 weeks? Now, when I came back to Australia, by the way, I was now a professor, full professor, head of a research centre, advisor to the federal government, the Australian government, OECD representative. I was top of the game. So I knew I could get whatever I wanted. So you want to send me there for 2 weeks? What if I need to go there for 4 weeks and swim in the lagoon for 4 weeks? And they said, all right, come on over for 4 weeks, and all this sort of thing. So I went over there multiple times. Guess what I found? That sediment has no impact at all on the coral reef. Why? It's an image of sediment. It's not real. The colour is the red clay. It's a colour thing. It's not real sediment. So when that clay went out and settled on the coral, which they were worried about, the very next tide in and out washed it off the coral. It was causing no damage whatsoever. And that's what a point I'm trying to get at here, is we think there's lots of sediment today, but there is not enough sediment to even create the smallest fossil. So something has gone interestingly different in our history. Yet we are told today that fossils are being created. Well, we know they're not. We're told that in the literature, but we know they are not because we cannot find one anywhere around the world. So, on your second page, I think I've got there, we're going to have a look at some of the examples. There we go. Second page. I'm going to show you how much sediment there really is on planet Earth in terms of today's processes. This morning I showed you how much sediment is there from the past, kilometres deep. But let's see how long it's going to take to get kilometres deep with today's processes. I'm going to put up some images. Don't try and understand them. I'm putting up complex images, just trying to impress you that I'm a scientist, okay? That's all I'm doing. Let's ask the question first of all. How much sediment gets put on the ocean floor? Well, we have sent teams out to monitor the ocean floor all around the world. Even the Great Barrier Reef has people, scuba divers, who go down and bring up the equipment to measure the rates of sedimentation. The highest rate of sedimentation in the entire world's oceans is 0.05 millimetres in a year in terms of the ocean bottom, not close to land, but ocean bottom. That's the red bits on that map. We have mapped the ocean floors. We have looked at the rate. In other words, 0.05 millimetres in a year, we would get 50 or 5 centimetres in 1,000 years. Does that worry you? It doesn't worry me. Can I create a fossil with 0.05 millimetres per year? I cannot create a fossil even with an insect I can't turn an insect into a fossil. It's not enough sediment. Why? Because the insect would simply rot away. It's not going to sit there for 500 years waiting to be buried by no, more than that. It's not going to sit there for hundreds of years waiting to be buried by 5 millimetres or 5 centimetres. It's not going to happen. So in other words, I have a big problem. Which is, why do we have 99% of all our fossils are marine, yet no sediment is today measured being deposited on the ocean floor? So that picture I gave you of that fish being fossilised is incorrect. That's not the truth. My scientific friend said to me, come closer to shore, Ron. Now there's another image that you don't have to really worry about. Let me explain it to you using this. Up on the top, let's turn this on. Top left there, the blue, that's the deep ocean. This is up around the Barrier Reef. That's Rockhampton down there. And this is a false image. It's a Landsat image. And it's the offshore area called the continental shelf. So in other words, it's underwater, but it's not the land. The land is all those bumpy bits over there. That's the land. Now, the measurements there on the continental shelf, by the way, that's called the continental shelf. What do we find? From hundreds of studies around the world, we find it goes up to 0.3 millimetres a year. Oh, that's so exciting, isn't it? 0.3 millimetres in a year. How can I create a fossil with 0.3 millimetres? I need it to be buried deep and fast, as I said. So in other words, that's not working. Even on the mangroves, when we come in to the mangroves area, we find that the rate of sediment being deposited to maybe turn a mangrove insect into a fossil is only 3.6 millimetres per year. So imagine that, 3.6 millimetres in 1 year. Can I create a fossil of an insect in 3.6 millimetres in a year? Absolutely not. So something's wrong here. Because when we read the literature in universities, there it is, there's the one from the American Chemical Society, says that fossils of sea creatures are more common than those of land creatures. Well, of course they are. There's 99% of them are marine creatures compared to 1% of land creatures. And it says because fossils, most fossils, start forming after the creature is covered in sand or mud. And it says those conditions are more common in the ocean. That's completely false. Thousands of scientists doing hundreds, if not thousands of studies around the world says there is no sediment being deposited in the oceans or the continental shelf or even the mangroves. There's the British Geological Survey saying fossils are more likely to be preserved in marine environments, for example, where rapid burial by sediment is possible. It's not happening. This is an argument we developed in the 1970s. Yet now in the 21st century, having measured it for all of these 50 to 70 to even 100 years, we're not finding it. So we have a real problem here, a real problem, because fossils are not being created today. My friend said, come onto shore, come onto floodplains. Just out here, you've got floodplains. And we can dig down in them, and we find there that yes, on one farm you might get a bit of sediment deposited there, a little bit, if it's a bad flood and things like that. But I don't want just a little bit of sediment like that. I want sediment big enough to cover thousands of square kilometres, because that's what happened in the past. And so here we see that in the middle figure, 3.2 centimetres per year, is Fiji with a 100-year flood. Comes only on average, once every 100 years. And the highest amount found, one of the highest amount found over a large area, was 10 centimetres, and it was found by me because I was an expert looking for it, and I found it in New South Wales, in Australia, 10 centimetres. That's still not enough to create a fossil, and I'll show you more in a moment. So my friend said, what about the tsunamis, the catastrophes, the disasters? How much sediment, and can we create fossils now? Well, there we are at the world's largest tsunami, particularly that hit the Indonesian coastline. And what do we get? 10 centimetres. 6 to 12. This is done again by hundreds, if not thousands of scientists all around the world measuring all of these events. 6 to 12. You go, how come a tsunami does not give sediment? How come it doesn't tear up the landscape? The answer is that a tsunami wave is not a physical wave. What do boats do when they hear that there's a tsunami coming? They go out to sea. Why do they go out to sea? Because it's not a physical wave. It's an energy wave coming in. It's an energy wave, not a physical wave. So you're not seeing a big wave being created. Its energy is being transferred. Only when it comes into shore, when the depth of water shallows, the energy is converted to a physical wave and it begins to build a wave, and then it hits the land. But it's only when it gets right close to the shore. So minimal damage is done in terms of sediment. It can destroy buildings, wipe out people, all of that, but it does not move the sediment. Isn't that fascinating? Doesn't move it. And that's the figures that have been studied are just incredible. So the one thing I will share with you was quite funny. In the Cook Islands while I was there, the New Zealand government, who was hiring me, paying me, said, Ron, we're all going down to the waters front. I said, why? They said, a tsunami is coming in. I said, are you people crazy? Why would I go down to the water's edge to watch a tsunami come in? Well, I thought, oh, if you're all going down and we're all going to die, I might as well go down with you. So I went down with them, stood there, and in it came. It was this big. That big. And as it came into the harbour, all the Cook Islanders cheered and clapped as this tsunami came in that big. Why was it only that big? The answer is because, as I said, as the water shallows, the wave is formed. In the Cook Islands, the water does not shallow. It's deep ocean, it goes straight up like this, and then you have the land. So as this energy wave comes in, it does not turn into a physical wave, it simply hits the edge of the island and bounces back. So, if you are on a shore and you hear of a tsunami coming, if it's a shallow, if you could walk out a long way and it's shallow, get out of there as fast as you can. But if you're on a cliff face, it doesn't matter. It's really interesting. So the point there is, look, we have spent so many years, so many scientists trying to understand how much sediment is there and can we form a fossil. The answer is we cannot. There is a fossil bed. That fossil bed, the Morrison Formation, is a sedimentary bed with trillions of fossils, but it is 1.5 million square kilometres in size. I'm going to ask you, have you ever seen 1.5 million square kilometres of sediment put down at once? And I'm talking tens, if not hundreds of metres deep. Have you ever seen that? No. So something happened in the past. That's what creates fossils. You need sediment metres and metres, hundreds of metres deep, coming in a massive way. So you can see where I'm going. I'm not arguing that fossils were created slowly over time. I'm arguing that all fossils were created at once, when there was a massive global catastrophe. So, a bit of fun with some experiments, by the way, that scientists do. The Canadian government decided to put some pigs, would you believe, on the ocean floor. Now, they did kill them before they put them out there, but they put them out there and they came back 20 years later to see had they become fossils. 20 years on the ocean floor. Now, when they came back 20 years later, they were stunned. Something's missing. Guess what's missing that would help make a fossil? Do you see any sediment? There's no sediment there. Because it's, as I said, we've already proven on the ocean floor There is no sediment. So they couldn't create fossils on the ocean floor after 20 years even. There's no sediment. You can still see the bones of the pigs. And they're not becoming fossil bones, they are decomposing, they're rotting, they're decaying. So a 20-year experiment was a complete waste of time. Had they come to me and said, is there sediment out there, I would have said, no, don't even waste your money. Here's another one. In Australia, Queensland University decided they would bury some baby crocodiles under 20 centimetres of sediment. 20 centimetres of sediment, and see how that would be affecting its fossil formation. Well, the funny thing was, and you would see it here, when something dies that lives in water, what does it normally do? Does it sink to the bottom? No. What does it do? It bloats and floats. And so we've seen that many times. Fish will float to the top. Does that mean they're becoming fossils? No, because they're not under the sediment. And we all agree you have to be under sediment. So the point there is simple. That little crocodile is a little one, by the way, not that big one there. A little one under 20 centimetres, bloated with gaseous material and broke out of the 20 centimetres and floated to the top. Now, if you're wondering about that, that's a deep scientific article. Well, my job is to rewrite it for you. And so I've rewritten it, and it's published in our Creation magazine, which I strongly encourage people to get that in order to give to other people. Because we tell the science as it really is, not the way it is written up in the journals. Another experiment was interesting. For 20 years they were trying to make, about 20 years, they were trying to make fossils in 24 hours. And so what they did was take lizard parts or insect parts, put them between two pieces of concrete and squeeze them overnight. And high temperature, high pressure. And open it up the next day, and for 20 years they went, ugh, it's just a mess. All this messy liquid stuff. Then they realised what we were saying as earth scientists. You don't find, fossils are not created by themselves, you need sediment. So what did they do? They wrapped up the lizard parts and the insect parts, put it into sediment, like wrapped it up in sediment, put it under high pressure and high temperature. 24 hours later, pulled it off and went, my goodness, we have created fossils in 24 hours. Guess what the secret was? What are you made of mostly? Water. You're made of water, mainly. So what happens is the water stops fossils being developed. So what has to happen is when you are buried, and if this is for you, if you want to be a fossil, you have to be buried so deep that the pressure of all that weight, hundreds of metres of sediment, is forcing the water out of your body. The water has to leave your body, then you can become a fossil. Isn't that fascinating? So that's what happens, and that's what they found, that you need the sediment. What does the sediment do? It absorbs the water and allows the fossils. So we now know, with all our experiments and all our measurements around the world, that fossils can only be created one way. Masses of sediment, so deep, all at once, puts you under incredible pressure, forces the water out of you within weeks or months. It has to do it within weeks or months, otherwise you will rot. Forces the water out of you and turns you into a fossil. That's how it happens. But today, we never see that happening anywhere on the planet. Nowhere on Earth are we creating fossils today. So we have a problem. Now that was a very interesting article, very hard to read in a journal. So I wrote that, again, writing it for the public. I wrote it for high school students. That's why the magazine is so good. For high school students, they can read it. And in that particular one, there's an article in there written by me, which is written for the public. And the final piece of evidence which stunned everybody was that in the year 2005, if you've not heard this, they cut a dinosaur bone in half. And guess what they found inside the dinosaur bone? collagen, red blood cells, and tissues that could be stretched and put back into position. Now here's the question. Do you think your red blood cells could survive underground for 65 million years? Because they say dinosaurs all died out 65 million years ago. Did that happen? Can it happen? No, it's impossible. And they said, she's wrong, this lady, this scientist. So they started cutting up other dinosaur bones, and guess what they found? They all have red blood cells and tissues. In other words, dinosaurs did not become fossils. We know that. Did not become fossils 65 million years ago. They became fossils only a few thousand years ago, actually. Because the medical people, the doctors, have said, you cannot keep that active for more than 10,000 years. You can't even do it. So that's an incredible discovery. So what do we find? We find that sediment today cannot create fossils. We also know that fossils were not formed millions of years ago. That's proven, scientifically proven. But our textbooks and our teachers still want to teach this in secondary schools and so on. But again, it comes back to this earlier discussion I had. It's a global flood did occur. So what I'm trying to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, is fossils do not represent evolution. They represent death. So why do we have so many marine fossils? I'll give you one little piece of science here. When sediment moves in a river, it moves at the early stages of a river, not in the big part of a flood. It comes in the early part of a flood. So what would get most sediment is whatever became subject to the flood in the early stages, and that's the fish and the coastal. Any creature that could get away by running or swimming or climbing is not going to be fossilized. That's why there's very few dinosaurs, very few mammals, birds, very few. The only birds that are fossilized were those that are coastal and couldn't run away. In other words, it's a death sequence. And it didn't capture all life. It only captured the life that was caught in the early stages of the flood. But it's a single death sequence. Just to finish off, I want to talk about another dilemma in the 21st century. And that comes back to sort of what Dr. Con was mentioning earlier on. In that we know that Jesus is another dilemma. It's another elephant in the room, if you like. We know that Jesus and all the authors of the books of the New Testament believed in the book of Genesis was historical and foundational. Yet today, the problem we have as Christians is many Christians do not accept this. You would have come across them. They're not being unfaithful to God, they just don't understand. So many of them don't understand. Why is this important? Well, it was important to me because from a scholar's point of view, when I was trying to understand Christ, it was important to know that the book of Genesis is important. If it's important to Jesus and the New Testament authors, then it's important to me. Now remember the journey that my wife and I went through this morning. An atheist and an agnostic went into a church. The atheist had read the book of Genesis, which opened up her heart. The agnostic had studied the book of Genesis, or the processes of the book of Genesis, the flood. And so my heart was open too. The book of Genesis is so important. But here's another point. The book of Genesis is very important to us from an evangelical point of view. Very important. Just remind you, when Paul went amongst the Gentiles, did he talk about Davidic promises and Abrahamic promises? No, because he's not speaking to the Jewish population. Peter did that. When Paul went into the Gentile population, what did he speak about when he was talking about Christ and salvation? He was talking about creation. He was talking about creation over and over again. Let's have a quick look at whether Jesus talked about creation. Of course he did. Caesar's image. He is now referring back to Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Very important. I'm highlighting here that Jesus talks about the book of creation. The New Testament authors talk about it. Jesus talked about the book of Genesis in marriage and divorce. Genesis 1:27. Jesus talked about Sodom and his work in Capernaum. Have a look at that there. It's in Matthew 11:23 to 24. That's when Jesus said to the people of Capernaum, I've shown you the message, I have shown you miracles, yet you have rejected me. Had I gone to Sodom and shown those people the miracles and the message, what happened in Sodom wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have died like that. Isn't that a powerful message? I would have been very worried if I lived in Capernaum at that stage, if that was the message. Jesus also spoke about Noah's flood. In other words, Jesus kept referring back to the book of Genesis as truthful and historical. He used it to explain his own ministry, such as comparing Sodom and Capernaum rather. He used it with Noah's flood to talk about the past and the future when he returns. And this is the scripture I love the most, and the one I'd just like you to note the actual message there. Don't write it all down. Just write down Colossians 1:15 to 17. 1:15 to 17. Which is, he is the image of the invisible God, their firstborn of all creation. For by him and through him all things were created, in heaven and earth, whether visible or invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is an extremely important piece of scripture pertaining to Jesus and creation. Why? Well, to highlight it, I have underlined and bolded and italicized the word before the word him. What do we see? We see that Jesus is the centre of creation because it is by him, through him, for him, and in him. You get the message I'm trying to get across to you? Creation and the connection with Christ, who is the Creator, it is by him, through him, for him, and in him. That is so important. So we must never look at the book of Genesis and the creation message. We must never look at it as something that's separate to Christ, or that Christ didn't know about it. A few other points before I close off. Luke in the book of Genesis. Look, Luke was a historical book, but he referred to the book of Genesis more times than any other author in the New Testament. At least 16 times he referred to it, and yet he's a historian. He's giving you history. What about Paul? Well, I mentioned Paul. Paul wove creation into his entire message, particularly the book of Romans. When you read the book of Romans, you'll see creation, salvation wrapped up in one message. Very powerful. And Paul explains that Jesus was an atonement sacrifice for sin. And if we don't believe in the book of Genesis, we have a real problem with that. Interesting, he goes on that Adam's sin affects all who are descended from him, but the wonderfully good news for us is that Christ's obedience affects all those who believe in him. In other words, whilst Adam affected everyone, not all of us are going to accept Christ. And as we heard from that Frank Zindler chap, if Adam is mythical, then Christ is redundant. He has no purpose whatsoever. I could show you much more. Peter talks about it. I won't even worry about that too much. But even the book of Jude has 4 references. In other words, every author of the New Testament either speaks directly or alludes to the elements of the book of Genesis. Not one author bypassed the book of Genesis. Isn't that incredible? Yet today we have Christians saying it's not that important. And Con will come back with more on that in the end. So we've got these Christians saying it's not important. They argue that Genesis is not true. As I lay in hospital, I'll put 2 of these up there. As I lay in hospital after brain surgery, I was allowed to go out to a pastoral library and read about Genesis. A whole column of book on Genesis. Did you know what? In this pastoral library, not one book said Genesis was true. Isn't that so sad? But that's what we have today. Comments like the second one, waste of time to discuss the potential seaworthiness of Noah's Ark. The flood is a story, not a true event. Yet we have proven it from a landscape point of view. We have proven it from a fossil point of view. We could prove it from so many other ways. And we need to be careful of false teachers. And I'm going to end on this point. Did God really say in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is within them and rested on the seventh day? Because we have pastors travelling around the United Kingdom, for example, Steve Chalk, who says down the bottom, far from being infallible, it's flawed. Creation and the fall of Adam and Eve is not history, it's a myth. Boy, we've got a big problem with that. That pastor goes from church to church, denomination to denomination. And another one, just to end it up, God said, and behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth. I hope my talk earlier today and today convinces you, without a doubt, from scientists all around the world, including secular scientists now say a global flood occurred. Why is it that Christians are still writing books like this? And here is John Walton writing a book, Wheaton College, The Lost World of the Flood, saying the flood never occurred. And that book is basically in every Christian library in the world. He is invited around the world to speak in universities. Why? Because he's tearing apart Christianity. He says it never happened. Isn't that sad? And so I leave you with this one then. As Jesus says, beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, looking like Christians, sounding like Christians, claiming to be Christians, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. Matthew 7-15. So Jesus accepted that the book of Genesis was important, correct, foundational, historical, and so too did every other author of the New Testament. Jesus accepted it. All the other authors accepted it. Here's the question for you to take home tonight. Do you accept it? Thank you, Pastor.